It was a perfect spring evening, and I was curled up on the couch with my partner watching a movie, which was always one of my favorite things to do. And next thing you know, I burst out the front door holding a leash in one hand and my shoes in the other, running down the street with the dog running behind me. I always made sure to take the dog when my partner was having one of his fits of rage. And he would sometimes get in the car and try and look for us. So this caused me to duck behind parked vehicles when I seen headlights coming, or I would yank the dog in some bushes and I would hide until I would see the car go by. I would do this all the way to our familiar park, to our same old bench, where I would sit and cry in the dark and try and figure out what just happened so I could prevent it from happening again. That, of course, never worked. A lot of people say they would just leave an abusive relationship. And to be honest, I said the same thing. But the simple leave solution doesn't accurately match the statistics or my own actions. So what are we missing? I would love to share with you what I've learned. My name is Cher Obediah, and I'm Mohawk Ojibwe from Six Nations of the Grand River, which is a First Nations community an hour west of Toronto. But I grew up off reserve in a city called Brantford, Ontario, which is also lovingly known as the home of Wayne Gretzky. I grew up culturally disconnected as a result of government assimilation policies aimed at Indigenous erasure. And they had laws to kill the ceremonies, laws to kill the culture, laws to kill the language, and it really caused a lot of brokenness and intergenerational trauma. And I knew that my partner's past was heavily affected by this. And so it caused me to have an unhealthy compassion for his behavior. Plus, he was really great at reminding me that he was a survivor and that it took a long time for him to love and accept himself for who he was. And so he needed to surround himself with people who also loved and accepted him for who he was. And that caused me to expand my patience even further. So there was a lot of persuasion, or what I like to call the slow turning of the psychological key. People see the outcome of abuse, but they do not see the turning of that key. I didn't even see it, and it was happening to me. My partner could sway my behavior in a loving way, in a way that made sense, in a way that moved in alignment with my values and my morals that caused me to feel like I was doing the right thing. For example, if I thought that things weren't going well and I started to back up, my partner would say, it's normal for couples to argue, to go through those stages of storming before they get to norming and then performing. And I wasn't familiar with this whole growth analysis, but it did make a lot of sense. So we stormed on. And when I felt like we were dealing with some of the same issues over and over, he would say, that's because change takes time. We're all perfectly imperfect. And if you're focusing on the negative and expecting perfection from others, those aren't healthy habits. And I thought that was valid. And so I worked harder at being less critical. And when I felt like I was making compromises for the relationship that didn't quite feel right, he said, that's because growing pains are uncomfortable. When we're doing things that we're not used to and we're stretching our comfort zones, it's uncomfortable. And I value personal growth. And I wanted us to move in alignment with who we were. And so his behavior, his reasonability gave him permission to keep behaving badly. And it caused me to feel as though we were working on the relationship, that we were building our strength, that we were working on personal growth. And I had no idea that I was inching away from myself and that I would become someone that I would soon not recognize. One day, I left my grocery cart in the middle of the grocery store and I ran out and drove straight home because I forgot my phone. Missing his calls and text messages could range anywhere from crappy subtle comments all the way up to explosive. It would really depend on his mood. and I got really good at studying his moods. I could hear the slightest agitation in his voice. And if he was walking towards me, I could see it in his walk. Learning to bob and weave around his moods and emotions became a full-time job, and I worked really hard at keeping the peace and keeping things simple and normal, which is ironic, really, because there's nothing simple or normal about abandoning your cart in the middle of the grocery store. When I think about that now, it is really hard to believe that that was me. After we split, it took a long time of me forcefully leaving my phone at home and leaving. And I would do that on repeat until I stopped having that anxiety and panic. I had to undo that psychological knot. And you'll be happy to know I don't hide in bushes anymore. And my groceries, they make it home every single time. This is how I know that abusers psychologically steal lives every single day. It is a crime for which no punishment exists. And to make matters worse, society judges the victim. Also a crime for which no punishment exists. Because when you're telling somebody that you must like abuse if you're staying, that only encourages silence. And silence leads to shame. Shame leads to hopelessness. Hopelessness leads to depression. And when you hit that pit, you straight up don't care anymore. It is hard enough just to get out of bed. Never mind make plans and find a place to live and call around and pack and move with no money, by the way, because your savvy survivor partner has also manipulated the finances. Don't fool yourself about resources either, because shelters are chronically underfunded and overwhelmed. I wasn't at the point of living in a shelter, but I did access their free counseling. And one day after one of our sessions, we filled out the paperwork so I could get a safe place to live. And she said my name would be on the waiting list for a year. I cried on the spot. According to CBC Investigates, women in Canada are turned away from shelters 19,000 times a month. Not a year, 19,000 times a month. And that's just in Canada. Never mind the fact that this is a global catastrophe that has almost doubled during COVID. It is being called the pandemic within the pandemic. And people seem to think that domestic violence is associated to poverty. It's actually associated to people. Abuse wears a suit, a tie, a badge, stilettos, a cross. Abusers are doctors and lawyers and CEOs and executives, because those who struggle to matter as children will often work towards positions that help them matter as adults. And according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience intimate partner violence. That means it is happening to you or someone you know right now. Both men and women. Because wounded parents raise both boys and girls who grow up to traumatize others with their trauma. If I didn't live this myself, I would still have that same old stereotype of I would just leave an abusive relationship. And that is one stereotype I am ready and willing to help fight today. Because it's not what you think. My partner, he offered a high level of love. He bought me flowers for no reason all the time, which I thought was adorable. He valued my opinions. He supported me. He was loving and charismatic, and people loved him. And sometimes if I didn't know where he was, I'd look outside and he'd be visiting this neighbor, or he'd be chatting with that neighbor. And they would have no idea of the psychological torture that he was capable of. And they never said, Cher, why don't you just leave? They said, aw, what a beautiful couple. Abuse can look like a wedding photo. And until you're willing to see it differently like that, the psychological key can continue to grind through the minds of the next generation and they do not deserve to inherit our mistakes. They deserve to inherit the strength of our wisdom and our lessons. So here's 3 things that you can do to help create change. 1, stop saying I would just leave and start visualizing the psychological key, because mind manipulation can happen to anyone with a mind. And scholars of survival have spent their entire lives learning how to manipulate. As Maya Angelou said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. 2, it is rare for the wounded and the abusers to go and seek help, but what has proven to create a difference, to nudge them towards healing, is when their family and friends stop looking the other way and start calling them out on their behavior. I once asked someone on his side if she would be willing to be a third party in our communication, because near the end, that's when it gets most toxic. And she said no, because he said no, which is obvious because abusers can't do what they do when the door is open. And when I told her that, she said, "I'm sorry to disappoint." Well, I may have been disappointed, but the greater disappointment is this solidarity with silence, because that only amplifies the violence. Protecting them is part of the problem. And 3, please move in alignment with your intuition, that inner guidance system that helps you to hesitate when you're not moving in alignment with your authentic self and your truth. My partner wanted me to come home early, make an agreement to come home early when I was visiting my friends, and I didn't feel good about that agreement, and I didn't really want to do it. But again, he's a professional persuader, putting it in a way that's good for us, and couples compromise, and so I agreed. And it ruined my evening. I was staring at the clock all night. I didn't want to say anything to my friends. We had drove in the same vehicle, so I was late. And he used it against me 1,000,000 times. I don't know how to compromise. I don't know how to make promises. How can he ever trust me now? The point is, I knew it, that I shouldn't have made that agreement that I didn't want to make. I went against my own intuition time and again, and it really cost me. So it's important to pay attention to what you feel, not just what you think, because they will often have your thoughts lovingly tied in knots. I know that if we all view domestic violence differently, view victims differently, change the way we talk about it, change the way we respond to it, then a more peaceful future will be the outcome. What are you willing to do on an individual level to lend to that? Thank you. Chimigwech, Nyawe.